Adaptations when it comes to any medium isn't an easy thing to do. You can't always have a one-to-one in most cases, simply because you either got something too big or too short, depending both on the original medium and what you're turning it into. Putting a full book into a movie would likely result in the movie being longer than all 3 Lord of the Rings films rolled up into one, for example. But even with that in mind, there are some choices that are made that often leave the viewer confused if they're familiar with the original source. And I feel like the recent release of the Cuphead show shows this expertly. Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am your ever-friendly PokeProf, and welcome back to Fascinating Fiction. So in the last week or so, we had the long-developed cartoon version of the popular boss battle video game Cuphead come out, detailing the adventures of the rubber hose-style character trying to get out of his deal with the devil by claiming all the other contracts that were past due. A game known for being a boss-focused shooting game, this was an indie-developed explosion of popularity that was only really seen before with Undertale, and even then that comparison really isn't that fair. As for the show itself, it's decent for what it is, emulating the style and storytelling of the characters of that same era of history, while having some bits being connected from episode to episode. And while the end product is alright, and even pretty good in some points, I kind of feel like it's lesser than it should be. Let's start by actually taking how they presented the show itself story-wise, going for the feel of the old rubber hose cartoons by having little, if any, connective elements in the story. And while I can understand the attempt here, I actually feel like it was the wrong choice for presenting Cuphead as a whole. One of the major driving points for the character in his game is the fact that by making a bet with the devil and losing, Cuphead is now forced to go and regain the contracts of everyone else who thought they could cheat Old Scratch. In many ways, he was very much the actual villain instead of the hero of his own game, since he's doing the devil's dirty work for him. But this actual element of the character, the driving force behind the entire game itself, is lost within the cartoon. Instead of making a full-on deal with the devil, Cuphead loses his soul because of a game of skee-ball that doesn't even advertise what happens to the loser. Because of this setup, you lose out entirely on the motivation of our main character to go throughout his adventures, which immediately makes things feel less important and leaves us less invested in what's going to happen. And, hilariously enough, this also kind of works against the character of the devil. Yes, I know this sounds weird, but let me explain. When it comes to the Big S in terms of how he's described in media throughout the years, he's usually placed within the role of villain to be sure, but he's had a few key elements that have kind of always been there. One of the biggest aspects that nearly every version of the devil has had is the fact that in order to take your soul, he has to make a deal with you and win. The question of whether or not the devil himself holds up his end of the bargain, or even plays fair when it comes to the deal itself, usually is a no, as even the end of the Cuphead game has the devil turning the main characters into his demonic minions if they fulfill their part of the contract. But the point remains here, the fact that he has to make a deal in the first place. In the show, that isn't the case. The devil can just take your soul whenever, seen by the skee-ball here and the winning an easy game with King Dice later on in the show. What's more is how the devil is portrayed after he's got a claim on Cuphead's soul. Even if you ignore the fact that, well, he's the devil, and 9 times out of 10 he's portrayed as the big bad of the story in most other mediums, he's still the final boss in the Cuphead game itself. The only way you even get to fight him in the end of the game is to defeat all the other bosses first. By being the final boss, being related to all those other characters by owning their souls, there's an air of menace with the character that you really wouldn't get otherwise. That's lost entirely in the cartoon here, where the devil is more like Tom the Cat, there mostly to provide a foil for Cuphead, and ends up usually the one being shut down by our heroes. Hell, there's an entire episode where after getting a magically invisible sweater, don't ask, the vast majority of the devil's role is to come in, try and grab Cuphead's soul, and get electrocuted. This is supposed to be the big bad of the series here, and yet the cartoon is treating him little better than they might treat Sylvester. The devil isn't the only character that has an issue in how he's used in the cartoon, however. Being inspired from a video game where the whole point is to do a row of boss fights with imaginative and creative characters, you've got to ask the question of why so few of them are actually used at all. Not counting King Dice, who's more closely related to the devil as a whole, we get to see a grand total of 3 bosses actually used in the show outside of the theme song that were characters in the game. Grim Matchsticks the Dragon, the Toad Brothers, and the Root Pack. Think about that for a moment. In the original game of Cuphead, there's a total of 19 bosses with multiple different forms between them all to actually evolve in the story of the show. And of those 19, only 3 of them are used in major story elements, with only one of them, the Toad Brothers, actually being even remotely close to how they were originally portrayed, with them owning a nightclub on a ship. And would you like to know their reason for being involved in the plot of the episode at all? Cuphead and Mugman ate each other's ice cream and were getting upset at each other over it, and just so happened to find out that the Toads were offering free ice cream with admission to their nightclub. It takes all the importance out of the characters when the entire reason they're even in the show in the first place means nothing to Cuphead himself outside of me wanty sweets. One of the other problems I think the show actually has comes down to its animation. Now don't get me wrong here, the animation itself is fantastic, and let's be 100% honest, animation is as hard as heck to actually do. These folks should honestly be getting more money, but even with that in mind, there's still an element of direction that I've got a problem with the Cuphead show, and that's the fact that it feels too modern. What exactly do I mean by this? One of the big aspects of those old-timey cartoons was the fact that they were not limited to the rules of reality, and the characters could squash, stretch, and overall reform into different things to suit the cartoon as needed. It's something that you saw replicated in the game quite often, where the bosses would actually have additional forms that drastically changed their base appearances. The Toad Brothers we've been talking about for the last few minutes, for example, turned into a giant slot machine as their final form in the fight. We don't really get to see anything like that in the cartoon, with most of the characters staying on model for the entire show thus far. The devil transforming doesn't really count, considering his whole thing is deceiving others with disguises. It makes sense that he'd be able to shapeshift. Then, at the end of it all, it's the events of the cartoon itself that I feel like really misses the mark. Every episode feels distinctly small time as far as what actually happens, with things like the aforementioned ice cream episode, or an episode where the characters are taking care of a baby that turns out to be a monstrous terror. These are story ideas that you would see in the old cartoons and shows from back in the 30s, of course, but that's what makes it feel even more weird for basing it as part of the Cuphead cartoon. The game's entire point was the fact that it was a high-action run-and-gunner that used the rubber hose style as its design, but not in how the characters would act or talk. By the cartoon going so deep in emulating that style, having it be the core of how these stories are told to us, not only does it not really relate well to the audience, it bores people as well, since these are things we've all seen before. Let me repeat what I said before though. The Cuphead show isn't a bad cartoon. It's wonderfully animated and has a pretty solid voice cast. But the problem here is the fact that we've seen this all before. We've seen the wacky cartoon characters in this art style solving problems that were old and tired even back in the 30s. There's nothing here that's offered that would be any different than turning on an old Merry Melody or Disney short. You're just using the Cuphead characters instead. I personally feel like this would have been a really good chance to actually give us characters in this style, but do something completely new with it. Sad to say, we're probably not going to get anything like that, but at the very least we can enjoy what we have. Do you disagree though? What are your thoughts on the Cuphead show? Do you feel like this is a nice return to form for cartoons? Or are you like me and would have preferred something more? Regardless, I hope I've done a good job to entertain you, and I'll do my best again to do so in the future. Hopefully you'll follow along with my content by subscribing and doing all those other things that gives us YouTubers life. But until next time, stay frosty.